So hello, everybody. So this is going to be the last part of the theory part. I apologize because there may be a chance that somebody rings the bell and I need to stand up to answer the door. Sorry about that. So I will mostly today cover something that we call algorithmic auditing, and I will cover it mostly from the perspective of what has been done so far. So the AI Act introduces some um text that may impact how auditings are done, and I'm going to comment briefly on that. But there are no like AI Act derived auditing practices today that are, let's say, in place. There has like there are many ideas about regulatory sandboxes where some algorithms could be tested and audited, and it's everything like a little bit moving ground. So I'm going to focus on things that have been established in the algorithmic fairness literature and in the algorithmic fairness practice as audits, as algorithmic audits, because I believe that most of whatever is audited, whatever shape these audits take in the future is going to be at least inspired by how the algorithm fairness field have done these audits so far. And this type of audits, we're gonna focus on fairness today. But let's start with what does it mean to audit, right? So the most common place where you may have heard of an audit is a financial audit. And a financial audit is normally when there is an independent organization that examines your financial information, sometimes with your consent freely given. Yeah, you're undertaking a financial audit of the organization because of some reason to comply, or it may be an external organization such as a tax revenue or internal revenue system or tax authorities checking like your books, right? In general, audit kind of reminds us of this idea of financial audits. Now, more generally, and now coming not from the business side, but more from the technical side, audit in technical cases is more related to conformance testing. So that means we test whether a particular technical system complies with it's has been done according to certain requirements, right? So for instance, here the third and fourth image that you see on my screen, and do you see my cursor, right, Daniela?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. And if there is any comment in the chat, please tell me because I cannot see
Yeah,
them
yeah,
well.
I know, I'm here.
Yeah. So, for instance, here you can have whether an electric grid has been installed according to standards, or whether food contains like a certain amount, like an amount of bacteria below a certain rate, a certain number, also established by a standard. In general, an audit is a tool for interrogating something complex, something that has many parts and where the parts interact in complex manners. And an algorithmic audit specifically is the scrutiny of an algorithm, and it's done usually in a manner that is quite systematic. And I will show you one particular framework for auditing algorithms that we developed with some colleagues. But in general, any process that you can think that can be systematic and can be like interrogating pieces of this complex system and how these pieces interact can be considered an audit. Now, discrimination has been studied from the perspective of audits in the past, before even like technology was so prevalent in this, before like we were starting to see like this intersection between technological advances and discrimination. Audit studies of discrimination were carried, and they were usually considered by researchers field studies because they were studies where you will go out in the field and look at some phenomenon directly. It will not be an experiment in a lab, and a field study will be more like a really an observation in the field, right? As where something is being done or where something is being applied. And the most common form of audit of discrimination that you may find in the literature, in the pre-existing literature, are these things called correspondence tests. And I struggle a little with the correspondence word because I always thought it meant matching, and it actually means correspondence, like literally letters. And these were studies that have been carried for decades, where people will just send like a CV or a letter addressed to a certain authority or to a certain in a company where a position was open with the intention of checking whether the response rate of this mail were different depending on, for instance, the name of the person, right? So they typically will be sending 2 CVs or multiple CVs that were differing only in protected characteristics, where education and everything was equal, except that one of these person was called Jonathan and the other was called Mohammed, for instance. And then see whether both people, both person will get like a phone call at the same rate. Now, in some cases, these tests had been done even through actors that apply for a job and or go to through a job interview even. And there are some there is some documentation about like researchers doing these kind of studies in the past before like technology was so prevalent in this kind of area. Now, why do we audit all algorithms in general, even before the AI Act? So normally we audit algorithms when we have some normatively significant questions, right? So some questions about how things should be, and that are related to, in this case, the right not to be discriminated mostly. And I will, like there are, for instance, at least 3 areas where like these algorithms have been described. So for instance, whether in a, for instance, in a platform to find a home, whether you are less likely to find housing. So for instance, in my case, when I was searching for a rent in Barcelona, I found an ad that said, you have to be Spaniard. And I took this to the actually to the Non-Discrimination Commission in Barcelona, who contacted this housing platform, and they pulled the ad out. And indeed, in Barcelona, there had been a case where one of these companies was given a ticket. How do you say this? Was given
a fine.
A fine. Thank you. I was thinking a fee. Thank you. Was given a fine of tens of thousands of euros for discriminatory practices in housing, and they were literally an intermediary, right? So they were not renting the house themselves. It was a job search platform that allowed people to specify that they wanted to rent the home only to a Spaniard, and that is not allowed by by Spanish law. So then there are other cases where, for instance, you may audit media recommendation to understand if money is playing a role here. That there is a practice called payola, which is like where discographic companies will pay to radios to play the music of certain artists, or even price discrimination to check whether a platform makes good more expensive to certain demographics, to certain locations, and so on. These are things, reasons where, or questions that we may have that we may try to answer with an algorithmic audit. And now, the auditing, the moment in which an algorithm is audited is typically either pre-deployment or post-deployment. And here, if we connect these two concepts in the AI Act, there is a mandate in high-risk systems to perform risk assessment, and this will correspond to a pre-deployment internal audit of a system. Like it will include at least that part. And in the AI Act, there is also the mandate to perform continuous post-deployment monitoring. That means that even after the system has been placed in production, or what the software development people call production, the system has been deployed, there is still like an obligation to continue auditing how the system is performing, right? So but typically these are things are called pre-deployment and post-deployment, or like you can say pre-deployment, the typical example would be risk assessment. Post-deployment, the typical example would be continuous monitoring. So let's look at the question. When are algorithms audited? Like just a quick attention check. We wait for your answers. It's an easy question, but let's keep. It's a Friday afternoon, so it's important to stay here, right? So when are algorithms audited? That's the question. Remember, you just go to wooclub.com. The code is FINDHR10. So when are algorithms audited? Right? Easy question. Thanks for your answers. Of course, this is before and after being deployed. Pre-deployment auditing will be closer to a risk assessment. And actually, risk assessment may include steps even before. And post-deployment will be something like monitoring how an algorithm is performing. Thank you very much. So now, as I said, like auditing is usually in the technical sense, not in the financial world, right? In the technical side, is usually, and partially perhaps in the financial side, is usually considered something that is a conformance testing, right? So to check whether something conforms to a norm. But then the question is whether it conforms to what norm, right? And in some cases this is easy, right? So here you have the requirements for the maximum emissions of CO and particulate material at different points in time in the European Union. And you see here that there is a clear reference number, right? There is a quantitative bound. But in algorithmic auditing, when we are looking for discrimination, there are not such quantification. And indeed, European law, from my superficial understanding of it, because I'm a computer scientist, but a lot has been written about it. European law tends to stay away from trying to quantify discrimination and instead sees discrimination as something intentionally that is left open to considerations that have to do with the context in which this discrimination happened. So there is a very interesting paper. You can find it by the title uh, why discrimination testing will never be automated in Europe, something of that sort. And that paper speaks of this, precisely this, that discrimination in Europe is intentionally described as something where context needs to be taken into account, and it doesn't translate like to numbers in the same way as, for instance, the car emission bounds translate to numbers, right, when you do the testing. So the algorithmic testing will always include like many qualitative factors that will be important. Now, there is an important distinction between different types of algorithmic audits, and there are like different ways in which you can define this. The most common way in which algorithmic audits are defined is like whether this is internal or external. Internal will be something that is developed by company employees that have access to the entire system, right? To all the internals of the system, to all the relevant data to perform this algorithmic audit. That will be called an internal audit. And then you also have external audits, which are performed by researchers, by uh, um, oversight authorities, like could be data protection authorities or algorithmic authorities. They will be external or even an external company. And these are usually these algorithmic audits that are external are of two types, like adversarial or cooperative, right? So adversarial algorithmic audit will be when the company has no interest in being audited, has no obligation to be audited, and nevertheless there is some external researcher that audits like the company, like in that audits an algorithm in some form. Sometimes with no consent and for public interest reasons. This is performed by researchers and NGOs, and it has its own problems. Like I will talk about that for a moment. And then there are cooperative external audits where, for instance, sometimes the company itself procures this audit from a third party, or it has a legal obligation to be audited, and so on. Now, in many cases, like you can also consider that these modalities of algorithmic audit, internal and external, may coexist. So you may have a company that performs an internal audit, but then this internal audit is reviewed by a separate entity to ensure compliance. And if something fails in that review, maybe pieces can be externally audited, or an external audit may be mandated, and so on. Now, as a researcher, I have done external audits. Sorry, go ahead.
Carlos, there is a question.
Yes.
Are algorithmic discrimination cases being taken by individuals under equality laws in any countries, because there is very little mention of cases in the media?
Cases of algorithmic discrimination, probably not the right person to answer that, but like you mean cases in which the individual takes an organization to a court or something like that?
No. If such cases were prevalent and algorithm discrimination was prevalent, surely there would be cases taken to equality tribunals across the EU. So it's so either people are not able to discover the stuff, or it's hidden, or else it's not really happening that much.
Right. I think that's
hidden.
Yeah, so that's a great point, right? So that some of this discrimination is invisible and can only be uncovered through an audit, in this case, taken on behalf of, like, in the case of discrimination, and like this probably cannot be done for a single individual, because group discrimination is a pattern of discrimination, and it involves many cases and many different individuals. The same happens with other algorithms, right? So for instance, there was a case where a delivery platform in the US, not a legal case, but not yet at least, where a delivery platform in the US changed its algorithms, and the riders were left quite puzzled about whether this algorithm was good or bad for them, because for some of them the money they received from the platform increased, and for others it decreased. So they needed to kind of gather data together. So there is here like something that is perhaps adjacent to audits, which is like pure data gathering by people who are affected by an algorithm and may need to determine whether the algorithm is discriminating them or not. There is also, for instance, there is some text in the GDPR, if I understand correctly, about trade unions being like worker unions, being able to do on behalf of the people they represent, asking for like data, right? And in the case of the AI Act, there is like the possibility that platforms capture like protected data for the purposes of determining whether discrimination is happening. So I think this is it's a scenario that is moving. But I think what we gather from all of this, and I think what's important, I think, from your question, is that in many cases, to determine discrimination, you need data about more than one individual, and that creates a whole lot of issues.
Yes, well, I know in my country you can ask for that under, you can put a request in for information under the Employment Equality Act, and if the company doesn't reply, if it goes to hearing, it can be seen as evidence of discrimination.
Right.
But you can ask for statistical evidence of the hiring practice of a company.
Right.
And the company doesn't need to provide it, but if they don't provide it, it can be used against them in the hearing. Right. Like, I don't know if that's the same in other countries.
I think that's why I think these things will develop in the direction of some transparency requirements for companies that will come out of these internal audits. But everything is kind of in construction somehow.
Yeah.
But I think that the first step, for instance, for this to happen is to say, well, as you have a high-risk system, you have an obligation to do a risk assessment and some monitoring, then you have data. And here we are right to the point where we can say, well, the company needs to have the data because they have an obligation to perform these internal audits. And that opens everything.
It's just something that hasn't been mentioned in these lectures, but if you go into a lot of these HR applications, when you apply for a job, they ask you to input, say, your qualifications. They ask you to input your work history, all that information. But is that some way that course can all be used machine learning? But the question for me is, are they actually using machine learning on that data, which is put in these HR systems?
You mean whether the systems use
and these like that's one in the EU, but it's all these ones. If you apply to what's the one they all use, all Americans use,
LinkedIn,
work something or other. Well, I suppose LinkedIn is used quite a lot, but I don't know what data a recruiter seeing as opposed to a job candidate, because I can see that LinkedIn is profiling you and is profiling candidates, but I don't know what the recruiter sees. But I can see, as a premium, say, member of LinkedIn, like who's applied for a job and what qualifications they have, et cetera, et cetera. So are they providing information to LinkedIn? Because all this information could all be used to prove discrimination.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, let me move on.
Okay, nice.
So as I said, like internal audits may be mandated even. Like in the case of high-risk system, I would say that doing a risk assessment or doing a continuous monitoring process involves an internal audit. Maybe an internal audit is a good practice because it's broader than at least than the continuous monitoring. But I would say it probably fits very well the requirement, right? Now, external audits are a little bit complicated because for a researcher, because they may violate the principle of informed consent. So when you do an external audit, you are accessing data about perhaps a bunch of people that do not know that they are part of the experiment. So for instance, you may contact, like there are ways around it. You can even within a platform invite people to, for instance, donate data or do something so to be able to collect this data. Like for instance, if you can ask people to donate the data, as we have done with the CV donation campaigns. And there is another element that is a bit more subtle, which is that these platforms usually forbid you from employing any automated data gathering, right? This is a complicated issue. I think like here at universities, I think the usual practice is to try to give researchers like when researchers apply for ethics review or their research project and those violate the terms of service of platforms that don't allow automated access, then when the researcher can show that this is for the public interest, I think usually some ethics reviewer will allow them to proceed with their research, considering that assuming that this the researcher is acting it does not have other ways of accessing this data. Of course, if the platform offers a clean way of accessing data, it's different than if the platform doesn't offer that. So let's check this question, like why algorithm audits, and we're talking about external algorithmic audits, may violate the principle of informed consent. I will show you some examples of external audits in a moment. All right, so algorithmic audits may violate the principle of informed consent when the users themselves do not consent to their data being processed by the audit, right? So particularly if it processes personal data from the users of the platform, right? So in those cases, there are ways in which an external algorithmic auditing could be done, for instance, by not capturing any personal data from the users. But I think these external audits are problematic because at least because of these two reasons, right? Their platforms may not consent, and also the users of those platforms may not consent. Now, algorithmic audits have, interestingly, they have quite a long tradition, right? In the sense that, well, a few years even, which is a lot for computing, right? So you have many algorithmic audits for many different purposes in many different platforms. There have been algorithmic audits of systems like Airbnb and Google advertising and Facebook ads. Advertising is something that has been looked very closely by algorithmic audits done by researchers. Systems that do ride sharing and facial recognition systems that have been tested for discrimination. You have seen some examples of that. Recidivism risk prediction. Myself, I have done some of that. Also in homelessness prediction that is used by social services, and even child neglect. Those are those are some of the areas in which algorithmic audits have been done. Now, audits, there are many ways in which audit designs can be done. And here we're following a paper by Sandvik and others from 2014, where they look at like very, very high level ways in which an audit can be done. And the first type of audit that they describe is a code audit, which is where the platform discloses to the auditor the algorithm, like the technical, either the technical description of the process that is being done, or ideally the code itself that implements that process, right? And it can be maybe the researcher is associated to the platform, or this is commissioned by the platform to the researcher, or maybe there is a legal obligation to disclose the code. Like if those things happen, then a code audit takes place. Now, the problem with code audits is that one will very rarely see in the code of an algorithm that there is a piece of code that says, okay, if you are older than this number of years, then deny the mortgage, or if you are foreigner, then deny this whatever this, don't show this ad for this house, and so on, right? So the cases in which the discrimination is coded into the software, into the algorithm, are rare. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And I think just as the BMW emission, the emission scandal of a few years ago, where it was found that a car, the car systems were able to detect when the car was being tested and change the parameters of the engine to pass the testing, I think there is a possibility that an algorithm encodes something that is illegal in this case, or like such as direct discrimination. But I think those cases are rare in the case of job search. So, quick question: what limits the effectiveness of code audits? What limits the effectiveness? What's one of the major things that makes us think that maybe a code audit is not the end of the, that's not addressed like all the issues that we make, all the questions that we may have when auditing? We're collecting some more answers. I will show you other types of audit too, but what limits the effectiveness of a code audit? We wait for a couple more. All right. Yeah, that's correct. Like of course, there are two things. I would say that the fact that you require access to the code is an important one. But even if you have access to the code, consider that direct discrimination is not, in the case of job search platforms, we don't have reasons to believe that direct discrimination is frequent. And I think there is much more possibilities. There are much more possibilities for indirect discrimination, because direct discrimination will be, perhaps in some cases, unnecessary. It will be illegal, and we don't think that this is the usual practice of job search engines. Now, you also have other types of audits, like a non-invasive user audit, that will be simply running a survey over the users of a platform and asking them for their experience. So for instance, when I mentioned this case about riders, thinking that maybe the algorithm changed, the new algorithm that the platform was using was hurting their income. In that case, there is like a survey that the riders actually themselves organized, and to try to determine whether the platform was underpaying, right? Of course, there are many problems here. The users self-select to participate in these surveys or not. And of course, they also report what they see, and maybe what they see or what they remember is not everything that is happening in the platform. There are also scraping audits. In a scraping audit, what you do is that you extract data. This is usually called scrape. Like you scrape data from the platform through the normal web interfaces of the platform. That sometimes means that you impersonate you impersonate a random user from the platform. You create an account and you use a script to pretend that this user is like navigating to the platform and collect data during that process. Indeed, I have done something like that. I did it with a student for a master thesis. We queried LinkedIn and Viadeo in 3 countries, in Spain and France and the United Kingdom. We look for professions and for their translation in Spanish, Spanish, French, and English. And we measured the extent to which the representation of women in the top positions of those platforms. And what we found was in this case that there are many variations across professions that you may expect somehow, but there were also variations across search engines, and there were also variations across countries. Even the same, and even for the same profession in the same country, 2 search engines may give you a completely different representation of women. In some cases, this is fairly consistent, like some platforms showing in one country less women than in others, probably as a result of their demographic, the demographics of their user base. And maybe in other countries, the direction is the opposite. What's important is that this is like an example of what you can do with a scraping audit, where you externally and with that, and in a sort of adversarial manner, because you don't have the permission from the platforms, you can still determine that there is something fishy, that the platform is, for instance, underrepresenting women in a consistent manner or in a particular profession. Then there is something called a sock puppet audit. It's a type of a sock puppet, like it's a technical term that is used when you create like an artificial kind of user. And here what you do is that you impersonate not one user, but many users at the same time. And you introduce small variations among those users, and you try the platform to see whether the results differ in a consistent manner according to some characteristic of the user. I think the most famous example of that were experiments that were pretty foundational in the algorithmic fairness field, where a researcher studied whether Google will change the ads that they show if you tell Google that you're a man or you're a woman and you do everything else in the same way. So they will have a family of sock puppets, like in this case, Firefox instances, like running and pretending to be hundreds of different users. And those users will browse the web in a very predictable pattern, like all the users will do exactly the same web, visit exactly the same web pages. And then some of those users will set their gender to male and others the gender to female in their Google account. And then there will be more visits to Google and more searches to try to understand whether the ads change. This is a type of sock puppet audit. It requires some modest amount of computational resources. It is not like rocket science, and it's not like computation is so expensive, but it allows you to do this kind of experiment of understanding whether like whether a platform is indeed discriminating or whether it has different results for different groups. All right, so let me show you, maybe I can do a pause here, like a 10-minute break. What do you think, Daniela or others?
Yeah.
A 10-minute break could be fine.
Okay, there is a question I left
right.
for, it's related to the previous one.
Mm-hmm.
And could this type of discrimination be enforced, referring to the algorithmic discrimination cases? Bill, could this type of discrimination be enforced under Quality Employment or AI Act legislation, or other law, human right? Any lawyers here know? And
right, I think like what the AI Act, like most of what I see in the AI Act regarding audits are obligations to perform internal audits. That's my kind of my reading of most of what I see there is an obligation to perform internal audits. So somehow what we are seeing here are ways in which, well, we saw like some ways in which internal audits can be done, some ways in which external audits can be done. But I think legally, I think that I would say most of the obligations that we see today are internal audits. Now, as these things develop and then this may change, and we may see more obligations to, for instance, undergo an external audit, as we have seen in finance, where, like in many cases, you need to pass an external financial audit. But that requires the audit to be very well defined, and I don't think we are there yet. We're not at a point where audit for algorithmic discrimination is something that is so well established and so clear for everyone what it means, that you can just say, okay, now you have to undergo an external algorithmic audit because, for discrimination, because there is not an understanding at the operational level of what that means exactly. So this is something that is being built and developed, not something that is done and constructed. All right, 10-minute break, is that okay?
Yeah.
All right, so
I have a question.
Yes, please.
You spoke about scraping and impersonating users in the sock puppet audit, etc. Does this not violate ethics principles? You're not especially the sock puppet audit or something where you have fictitious users and.
Yeah, I think it depends on the. So I participate in the. I'm a member of the ethics review board at my university, and I speak for myself. So I will tell you what's my take on this. I think it depends on the details of what's going on, right? So, for instance, if you are impersonating users on Tinder and like a dating app, and sending messages to people who believe that you're a human, you're definitely creating harm, right? But if you are like impersonating users like with random usernames that are not interacting with anyone, but are just browsing the web and eating the cookies that Google implants in these plants in these different web pages for the purpose of determining whether there is gender bias in the advertising. And these sock puppets do not harm the operations of Google in the sense that they are not aggressively doing requests in such a manner that can break the system, crash their servers, or do like a distributed denial of service attack. Then I would say that the benefits like are more than the harms, and also there is like and there is no alternative to this. That's the other element here. Like, is there an alternative way in which a researcher can obtain this data? If the answer is no, and if this way of collecting data is not harmful to the platform, is not harmful to other users, then I would say that my personal inclination in an ethics review of such a research project would be to approve it, like condition to all these things being satisfied.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks for the question. It's a difficult question, but I think it's a good one to reflect on. So in the last part of this theory lecture, I will tell you a little bit about two audits that have been made in algorithmic hiding systems or system related. Well, there is a keyboard sounding somewhere. Okay. Someone has their mic open and it's typing. Okay.
I muted it.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to show you a couple of audits that have been done to systems related to algorithmic hiding that I think could be interesting for you. And then I'm going to describe a particular scheme for like a framework for auditing, like what could be possible steps to perform an auditing, both like ideally an internal audit or an external cooperative audit. So I'm going to cover two companies. One is Pymetrics. So Pymetrics is a well-known player in the algorithmic hiding field. There is this paper by Christo Wilson and others in 2021, where they study like how Pymetric candidate screening systems work. Pymetrics offers like many systems. One of those is a system to measure like some certain skills, like for instance risk-taking skills or like risk-adverse risk-taking or risk-adverse orientations of people. So for instance, there is this game with some balloons where you have balloons of different colors, and you have to click on the balloons to inflate them. And if they pop, then you get nothing. But if they don't pop, you can collect a certain amount of points. And your idea is to maximize the points, and that requires you to understand that some balloons can be inflated more than others, but also to do some trade-off with respect to how much risk you're taking, right? So those are games that are supposedly should predict your job performance, right? Now, this particular audit was done with respect to the was an audit focused on one particular aspect of discrimination as a product of these games, and it includes as training data, like some as many biometrics systems work. What they do is that they make, like, they ask the companies to have their high performance employees define some way to play these games, and those could determine those are the in groups somehow, like the people who you are supposed to interview and or you should be interviewed and you should focus on. And then other users randomly sampled from the results from biometric testing are the outgroup, and those are kind of the negative example. These are the positive and negative examples. And now, in these researchers, Christopher Wilson and others, what they did was to, they also have access to a random set of users from biometrics that have volunteer gender information and race information. And those were used as a reference to understand whether these games or these scoring systems were affecting negatively those candidates. And for that, what they did in their paper, and you can check the paper like with the reference at the bottom of these slides, was to use what in the US is known as the 4/5 rules, which means that the passing ratio of the whatever group has the lower rate should be at least 80% of the highest ratio of the passing ratio of the highest passing group, right? So so that means 80% of the other, right? So for instance, if out of 100 applicants, 10 men are accepted, but out of 100 women, so out of 100 men applicants, 10 women are accepted. 10 men are accepted, but then out of 100 women applicants, 8 are accepted, then this will pass under the 4/5 criterion, because the passing rate of the lower of the group with the lowest passing rate is 80% or more of the group with the highest passing rate. Now, according to the same rule, if out of 100 men applicants, 10 men are accepted, and out of 100 women applicants, 7 are accepted, then this will fail to pass the 4/5 rule. Is it clear? If you have a question, please place it now in the comments. No?
No questions.
All right. So in this case, biometric, like this paper determined that biometrics passes this rule in this criterion, in the sense that they examined several of these, like scoring, or they examined the scoring system of biometrics, and they determined that for instance, in the case of gender, the acceptance rate of both groups was within this 4/5 range. However, there have been many criticism of this work. You can read them here in this paper from 2022, like a year later. And it has to do with all the other things that are here, sorry, that are related to fairness here. Because this type of audit that looks very narrowly at whether a particular algorithm has a certain metric in a certain way, it's a type of, you could say, a type of algorithmic audit that is very narrowly defined and does not show that there are no adverse effects of a certain groups. Right, so that's it's kind of a really narrow piece of what an audit could be when you focus so narrowly on one particular element, right? In this case, at the passing rate. And also, as I said, like while in the US, you have this criterion that the Equal Employment Commission has used, that is at the passing rate of the group with the lowest passing rate should be 80% or more of the passing rate of the group with the highest passing rate. That is not, that's an American criterion, it's not a European criterion. There are no numbers, there are no similar numbers given in anti-discrimination law in Europe. So there is the audit is not like against that number in that sense. Now, let me give you another example. This is Humantic AI. So Humantic AI has personality tests that are applied to hiring, in general psychometrics. And the idea is that they assume that this personality is kind of a meaningful construct. So there are aspects of like of your behavior that are somehow stable over time, and those are personality traits. They assume that they can test for those traits, and and perhaps the strongest assumption is that those personality elements can predict employee performance. And now, what this paper does is something very simple, and they don't even look strongly at any of those kind of questions. What they just say is that this system fails in the sense that it considers factors that it shouldn't consider. So, for instance, in this case, what they show is that if you, for instance, if you submit a resume in a certain format, like a text file, then it will be analyzed in a different manner that if you submit an equivalent resume in a PDF format, right? So the algorithm is using factors that it shouldn't use in the determination of, for instance, your personality. And I show you a similar case, if I remember correctly, on the first lecture, where I show you that some system that analyze the image or videos of interviews, they were also sensitive to characteristics such as lighting, and they will change their personality assessment of a person based on the conditions of lighting in the room. So what I mean by this is that this is like, these are interesting starting points: the biometrics audit and the Humantic AI and Crystal audits. But in general, they show like how difficult it is to somehow define like how these audits can be made. Now, this is one. Now let's talk about frameworks, and I'm going to describe two and focus on the second one. So this is a framework proposed in 2020 for algorithmic audits. It includes like several stages, from scoping the audit to collecting some artifacts to reflect and perform some post-audit actions. There are processes, there are things that are done by auditors that can be internal to the company, as I said, and there are some requirements that are some documents that are produced by the product team, like, okay, what are your product requirements, what are your model cards, like that they describe how the models were built, what are your data sheets that describe how data, particularly training sets, are created, and so on. Now, we also developed, like in 2022, with some researchers from Telefonica, one of these researchers is at Facebook now, some framework for algorithmic audit with similar steps, and I'm going to walk you through these steps, and that's going to conclude my presentation today. So we'll now, like in the next maybe 10 minutes, I will show you what are these steps. So we start with like some context analysis, which I claim is very important, because otherwise we tend to focus very narrowly on a piece of the algorithm. Then mapping user population, considering which are the prioritizing the sense of determining which protected groups we're going to test for, select some metrics, calculate, analyze the results, and see if we can mitigate the bias. So first, there is this, and in the paper there is a more detailed description, is like this contextual analysis, right? So first, what is the type of audit? Is this done with the cooperation of the search of the, for instance, job search platform or not? What is the purpose of the audit? For instance, to perform a risk assessment. Then what is this system supposed to do? What are the uses of this system? So this system is for shortlisting candidates. This system is to help a HR person shortlist candidates, and so on. Then what are the features of this that this system will use? And here there are important questions about what are the theoretical basis, where there is a strong theoretical basis for this feature, where there is any for instance, legal mandate not to use a certain feature, like for instance, not to use the fact that a person, not to use the disability status of a person, while there may be a good theoretical basis to use whatever, like a test, a language test for a person who is going to work as a translator, for instance, for text, like whether the feature is fit for the purpose. Then there is something about the training data and whether the training data uses real targets or a convenient proxy. So for instance, in the case of Pymetrics, like the scores in the different games are taken from high performance employees of the company, which is a proxy for an employee that for a given position will perform well in that company. It's not the same thing. It's not usually done for a particular position, but it's done more like in general. So it's a kind of a proxy. And then the quality of the training data and how the model has been evaluated. So I have a question for you. So at which step of an audit do we determine the features to consider for the analysis? These are just a quick attention check.
And
at which...
there is also a question.
Okay, let's go for the question first. Question first.
Okay, this is not really a question, but it's for everyone. So analyzing personality traits is a special category data under the GDPR. I think psychometric testing is illegal under GDPR unless provided by legislation. Does anyone know if any countries allow under legislation?
Yeah, what I can contribute to that is that most of this kind of psychometric testing related to personality trait has very little, has been found to have very little scientific validity. Not the fact that you can predict the personality of a person, that's another story, and which also has its own questions, but whether this can be really tied to job performance. Most of these platforms like Pymetrics and Humantic AI, they test for soft skills because they cannot test for like really what you need for a particular position. So they are problematic on themselves from the fact that this is not like, if the justification is like the if the justification is the interest, like what's the name of this, the interest of the company, like the legitimate interest of determining who is fit for a position or not, if that were the justification, this like sometimes scientifically is not really well justified. Okay, let me go with the question because this was like a sidetrack. So at which step of an audit do we determine the features to consider for the analysis? It's a quick attention check. I hope you can answer it quickly so we can move on to the next, to the other steps of this framework.
There is a comment. This can determine people beliefs and health status, so is illegal without legislation. And regarding the parent company of Facebook that Carlos was looking for, it's Meta.
Meta AI.
You can enlarge a little bit the screen by clicking on the 100 on the bottom of the page, at the bottom of the page. Yeah. Yeah, there is the percentage. You can see it, Carlos?
Yes.
Okay, so in that way, yeah, exactly. So the font will enlarge. Okay.
Thank you. So yeah, so the answer is contextual analysis, right? So we are talking about the step in which we determine the features that we will consider for the analysis. So let me give you an example. So for instance, this is an example of the purpose of an audit, right? So we're going to check if the implementation is correct, like whether the implementation, the software correctly implement what it claims to implement. We can do a code audit to understand whether there is direct discrimination in the code. We can check whether there is an attempt at circumventing a measure, such as what I show you, what I talked about previously about the scandal of car emission testing in Europe, where this car manufacturer was found to have circumventing measurements built into their code. And then we can say, okay, we are not going to change the fairness objective function. We're not going to change categories, or we're not going to test for cybersecurity or things like this. Is like when you try to determine what is the scope of an audit, which is a very important step. Then we normally map the population in terms of describing what is the population of candidates and what are the protected groups that might be at risk. And we consider things such as age, gender, and other relevant factors. Here, there is like the grounding is sometimes is human rights, like, okay, there is human right not to be discriminated, and then there is a recital of a number of, like, there is a number of categories for which you're not supposed to be discriminated, or more narrowly, like employment regulations, and what are the categories that are protected in the sense that you are not supposed to be discriminated based on those grounds. So that will be mapping the population and what are the features that you are supposed to use for the testing. What are the characteristics that you're going to use for testing? Then the combination of different protected group can be really, like, can grow exponentially as you consider different intersections of group. So part of what we try to do, or what we have tried to do in my research when we do algorithmic audits, is to try to hypothesize what are the potential harms, not to go kind of on a fishing expedition trying to find where there is potential discrimination, which it's also a different approach, like where we really try to find if there is any intersection that is experienced like disadvantage with respect to others. But I would prefer to state this hypothesis more specifically, and to say, well, we are seeing in this case like gender and age. We're seeing an intersection of, like, we believe that foreigners are being discriminated, or what are our kind of hypotheses about potentially discriminated groups in the setup in which we are right now, right? So there may be, particularly, what are the visible characteristics that we believe that either the system, visible for the system, like instead of features used by the algorithm, or visible by the recruiter, what are the characteristics that we believe that the recruiters may be using, or may affect their judgment, or may make them discriminate, or do we have evidence of discrimination in the past? All of these are sources of how we're going to prioritize this analysis. And we go first and more in detail for vulnerable groups, or for including intersections of categories for which we believe, or we can hypothesize harm. This is really to maintain some focus on the audit, and instead of making it just a statistical exercise, to keep it grounded on our hypothesis about potentially discriminated groups. Then we can select some metrics for algorithmic fairness. Here, if we can make a cost-sensitive analysis, that's preferable. It's very rare that you can do that specifically, to say, okay, a false positive cost this, a false negative cost that. Probably not in job search. Then you can state a hierarchy of metrics. That means that there are some metrics that are core to your analysis. So, for instance, a metric could be the fraction of people from this protected group in the top 10 results, and that will be like, that's part of your core metrics. And you may have ancillary metrics such as, like, the visibility using some formula of different candidates, right? Then you need to determine at which level you are going to observe, means measure the metric. Like, is it the ranking that the algorithm produced, or you are going to evaluate a combination of machine and human? Like, for instance, when a human recruiter uses system A, they shortlist these candidates. When they use system B, they shortlist these other candidates. And there is where we're going to measure these metrics to determine if, for instance, the selection rate of candidates of different groups is the same. Just a moment. I'm sorry. As I said, I need to open the door. Just a moment. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, like, sometimes, Daniela, you can still hear me, right?
Yeah, I can.
All right, good. So as I was saying, like, there is like this this element that is at what level are we going to observe those metrics, at the level of the output of the algorithm, or as the combination of what the human does once that person has access to the algorithm, or we're going to check people who are eventually interviewed and so on, right? So at what level this will be observed. Now, selecting a metric can be quite difficult because there are many potential metrics. Here, what you have is a couple of what are called decision trees that help you understand what family of metrics may be useful for a particular purpose. Here we get more technical probably, and for rankings there are certain metrics, for classification there are other metrics, and so on. So this is a kind of a complicated issue. My recommendation in general is to consider like not only one metric, to consider several metrics, and to have a hypothesis about what the harm that your algorithmic audit is mostly trying to determine, right? For instance, if it is something like, if you have reasons to believe that the shortlisting depends on gender or depends on age, then you may be looking at something like selection rate, or you may be looking at something like true positives, like to how many people who are shown by the algorithm are actually selected, and so on. So there can be various ways in which you can choose these metrics. There are these decision trees that kind of help you. They ask you some questions to try to determine the metric, but I think what's most important, in addition to that, is what are your hypotheses about the harms that your algorithmic audit is trying to determine that may be happening. Then there are tools to calculate algorithmic fairness metrics. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You will do some data analysis in this course that will include some calculations about, like, for instance, the visibility of different people or something related to rankings. So you will see a little bit more of this in the data analysis part. Finally, you can analyze the results, consider the computed metrics, complement with qualitative analysis, and try to determine, okay, are you harming some protected group? Is your tool really is not providing the same service to a particular group, or is like a small margin by which there is a lack of parity? And this there is also something related to whether these things, particularly these metrics, are usually considered in over a time period, right? So you don't look at only one query, you look at several searches by sometimes by different recruiters, and then you try to aggregate things, because it's impossible that in every specific search, like, the representation will be perfectly like equal, for instance. Finally, you look at ways in which you can mitigate the bias. Depending on the severity, you may want to do different things. Normally, mitigation measures include pre-processing. That means changing the training data that you use, perhaps collecting data for minority groups that you may have in your data. Post-process the output, which means re-ranking the output of an algorithm, or trying to impose some criterion within the calculation of, for instance, a ranking, or within the calculation done by an algorithm. And of course, to document very clearly what are the limitations and the different things that you have found in your audit. So here is what I said about, like, intervention points. Pre-processing will be changing your training data, for instance, adding more training data from minority groups, changing the way in which the algorithm works, or post-processing the labels so that the output is made to satisfy a certain metric. So these are, again, the different steps of the framework I just presented. As I said, like, these things I think will stabilize with time, but at the moment they are really in flux, and there is like really, it's a very kind of open space how an algorithmic audit is performed. And what I believe is that these risk assessments and this monitoring will be grounded on the literature on algorithmic fairness so far, and probably adopting some of these frameworks. I have presented one of them in detail, but this, of course, may change in the future. There is a paper that I would recommend reading about algorithmic hiding biases. And with that, I will be happy to take some questions.
There is a comment. So Article 22 says you can actually use automatic decision making under specific conditions, including special category data. And the answer is you were provided for in legislation. So it's something related to previous questions.
Yeah. All right. More questions related to auditing? So I know some of these may sound, Maria, please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe it's a bit out of scope, but thinking of other totally different domains where auditing is applied, I was wondering, are there any examples or instances of more participatory auditing approaches where a variety of stakeholders and users are engaged in auditing an AI system?
That's a very good question. What I have seen related to these are more audits that are based on data donations. So people ask, for instance, I have seen it for Twitter, right? So people ask Twitter users to donate their the data, to download and donate their data from Twitter, or to download and donate the data from Spotify, and then researcher can compare, for instance, whether there are some biases in what people are seeing on Twitter, or what people are listening, or are being recommended in Spotify, and so on. So that's the most participatory somehow approach I have seen. In other cases, I haven't seen other cases of like something that where also the users participate in formulating the hypothesis, or indicating which harms they are interested on. I haven't seen those cases. I've seen more cases where the user, the broad participation is somehow a bit passive, in the sense that the participants are data donors basically, but they are not part of the formulation of the questions. So I think there is an important gap there. Yeah. All right. So
No
maybe
more
look.
questions? No, sorry,
Yeah.
Carlos.
No,
there
I'm thinking.
is a question.
Yes.
Even though, Chris, do you want to do it to ask it directly? Or
Yes.
even though we don't have the fourth, fifth rule in Europe, and even though non-discrimination law does not provide specific limitations for accepted discrimination, do you believe in the world where AI algorithms will take up an increasingly important role, that lawmakers and researchers should discuss these kinds of standards because there is a need perhaps for specific contexts?
I think I think this all starts like I like the question, but I think it all starts with performing these internal audits, and then what is reported here. I think what's important more is what is reported, right? So for instance, in our audits, we at the beginning we set a threshold. In some cases, that threshold is like 50%. We say we're going to report as a severe deviation from parity every time there is one of these is 50% more than the others. But it really depends on what is the context, right? So I think this may emerge, but I think first we need to look at numbers and see what are the results of these different audits. They are also this also has to, I think the practice needs to develop before there is like some question about what is a specific number that should be used for one thing or the other, but the practice needs to develop. I think also there is another thing about like internal versus external audit, right? So when you claim, like suppose that like down the line in a couple of years, these intelligent recruiting systems used in Europe, they start to advertise that they are free from bias, in the sense that whatever, they have been audited and they have determined that men and women are within 2% of each other in terms of visibility in their platform. interesting, but that those kind of claims are going to need some external validation too at some point. So yeah, I can imagine a number of scenarios. Like it's at this point, it gets really speculative. I think what's going to happen is that people will need to do the risk assessment. The risk assessment will involve an internal audit, and that's definitely an important change, considering that right now there is no mandate to do those. Before the AI Act, there was no mandate to do those. So I'll be happy to take one more question, if any. If not,
sorry, I don't know if someone else wanted to ask anything.
Go. Tell me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. So I just have a question, Carlos, which is really around kind of the topics you've discussed today and the topics we discussed 2 weeks ago, which was more around law and ethics. Mm. And today you spoke a lot more around the data in general, methodology, audits. And so, do you think that in terms of where we're going with AI and in this case we're specifically looking at employment and fairness, do you think the emphasis is more on the integrity and the methods deployed in terms of the systems used, kind of basically what you've spoken about today, or do you think the focus should be more on anti-discrimination and fairness, because it's like, I mean, they're interlinked, but they're also two separate things, because one looks at the impact of, not having accurate data or not using accurate data, if you can say there's such a thing as accurate data, or the wrong methodology. And one is purely focused on, the data and methodology. So,
yeah, so I think I think we're looking at like, so I think let me throw a couple of keywords here. So one is like process and the other is outcome, right? So I think one question here that I think that has to do with the development of these systems or responsible AI system has to do with the process, right? Whether the process that was followed to select the training data, select the metrics, create the platform and so on, whether that process was conducive to something we can trust on. And then the outcomes, which is like at the end of that process, when we measure like for instance, the visibility of different groups in the platform, whether we find those to be equal. So I think that's one part of what element of my answer will be considered process and outcomes, not only processes and not only outcomes. And the other thing is that, yes, like a responsible AI application is much more than an application that as an outcome satisfies a certain metric with respect to data. Absolutely, yes, absolutely, it's much more than that. And to determine that, still the process is called an audit, but it includes much more than auditing, like the outcome, auditing the process, and like examining the system through various lenses. Absolutely, yes.